The COVID-19 lockdown has forced many people to stay indoors. This was a good moment for the environment, at least, where there was less activity than what would normally take place, caused by things like pollution. Companies responsible for large emissions had to scale down, a move that was good for the environment as well. Joining us now to unpack the ramifications, if you like, is Professor Bob Scholes, who's a climatologist and acting director at the Global Change Institute at Wits University. Prof, thanks very much for your time and welcome to the AM report. It's an interesting perspective, and that's just one way of putting it, not least of which because many people don't often make the link between COVID-19 and environmental considerations. What are we missing?
So what you've just described is what we would call the forward link. In other words, the link from climate to the environment. There is also a backward link from the environment to COVID as well. So that forward link of the reduced pollution and the reduced activity and the return of nature in many places is long past. It lasted really only for that period of extreme lockdown. For the year to date, the reduction in carbon dioxide emissions is only a few percent. So as soon as the economy started to crank up again, we lost that advantage. What it did give us is a glimpse into a pollution-free future. So if simply a change in human activity for a period of a few months can make such a difference to the atmosphere, imagine what we could do if we, seriously engaged with that problem over the longer term. The other thing that it taught us was that many things that people had said were impossible turned out to be possible after all. For instance, combating climate change would only cost us a few percentage points of our GDP. And everyone said, no, that's far too expensive. But now we've just gone through a pandemic where we were, spending large multiples of our GDP. And it turned out that when the issue is urgent and people detect it as important, then they are willing to take major action. And that's what we really need to do around the environment.
Yeah.
In terms of,
Please go ahead. Finish your thought.
So in terms of the other linkage between, is there a link between the climate and COVID? When COVID started, there were a lot of theories that this was a wintertime disease. It would go away in the summer. That really has not proven to be the case at all. When the disease is in this extremely infectious phase, in other words, when there's still lots of people out there who haven't had it and so are susceptible, then you can catch COVID under any circumstances whatsoever. It can be freezing cold, it can be warm and sunny, it can be humid, it can be dry, you will still get COVID. So don't think that the climate is going to save you. Later on, once COVID just becomes one other disease amongst the many that we face every year, it's quite likely that there will be a small seasonal effect. In other words, we'll see a bit of a resurgence of COVID every year in the wintertime, mostly because that's when people crowd together. And that's the ideal conditions for transmitting the disease, rather than any direct effect of the climate on the virus itself.
Right. I'm interested to stay with this phenomenon of a forward link, as you put it, for just some time. Yes, we've learned that a lot of what's happened now isn't impossible, but there are still real questions about whether it's sustainable. And top of mind here, of course, are issues around our economic conditions and whether or not being able to allow the environment to recover in the ways that it has will, in fact, allow the economy to recover in the ways that we need it to. Have we struck a balance, do you think, yet? Or can we even strike a balance between those two phenomena, environmental recovery and economic recovery?
Yes, I think we can, because we are going to have to pour worldwide trillions and trillions into economic recovery. So the question is, do you pour it into rebuilding the same old, damaged, polluting economy, or do you pour it into a new green economy? So the idea is that you use this as an opportunity to actually move to a better economy, not the same old broken one we had. And for instance, in South Africa, that means that our next wave of energy generation plants need to be renewable energy rather than coal energy. because not only is it cheaper, but it's also far better for the environment. That's just one example.
Yeah. In many instances, I imagine through your work as a climatologist, you might have come across studies that give us an idea of how different weather conditions could affect how viruses work. I wonder how much insight has been given into how specifically COVID-19 works in places like the Southern Hemisphere, where there are relatively calmer weather conditions than, I guess, the extremes you're seeing in the global north.
So, the thing about this virus is it's actually a very, very simple organism. It doesn't have a proper coating on it. It's sort of got a oily, waxy coating on the outside, which is very vulnerable to environmental conditions. And that's why there was this thought that maybe it would get damaged by high temperature, or it doesn't really like high humidities, because then the droplets that it fall out of the air too quickly before it can transmit, or it might be susceptible to ultraviolet radiations that we get much of in summertime. So those are all plausible arguments why the environment could affect COVID. But it turns out that COVID is so efficient at transmitting that those effects, if they occur at all, are relatively minor.
And what does that then mean for an informed response from government to what we're now seeing, which is, of course, a second wave and a new variant of this disease? In other words, do you get the idea that voices from your sector, your field of study, are receiving as much attention as they should as government tries to carve out a way forward about how we can negotiate this environmental recovery, economic recovery, and dealing with what climate change actually means for something like the coronavirus?
So let's separate those issues, the sort of immediate challenge of the coronavirus. And in fact, nothing has really changed there. In terms of the new variant and vaccination, although we do seem to have a new variant out there, the rules remain exactly the same. This is transmitted by contact, close contact between people, especially indoors, through unsanitary practices. So wear masks, wash hands, don't form large crowds. The rules remain exactly the same. There's no indication that new variants will be not susceptible to the vaccine. So we need to proceed with getting as much vaccination out in the population as possible over the next 6 months. None of that has changed. If we turn to the bigger question, what do we do when this has passed? And it will pass. It'll pass, in the next 6 months or so. We'll be talking about a different circumstance. But then we shouldn't slide back into complacency. We need to use what we've learned here about responding to global crises and make sure that they address, in fact, the much more dangerous crisis that we face, which is the climate crisis. It's just unfolding more slowly. And we need to put the same energy and cooperation and public spirit into addressing that question.
Yeah. And what does that mean, practically speaking, for a global response now to the pandemic? And I'm only asking this because you might have seen in the last few days, US President-elect Joe Biden putting together what he says is, the kind of dream team to put together an ambitious plan against climate change. A lot of historic firsts, if you like, but that's a different conversation altogether. But, for a person like Joe Biden, whose positionality matters for our global response to environmental issues, how should he begin taking stock of the lessons we've learned? But not only that, ensuring that there's enough buy-in from the globe, essentially, to back whatever plan he comes up with.
So this year will be really important, both for the climate and for biological diversity. It was meant to be last year.
Yeah.
It was 2020 was the year when Paris commitments came up, to be ratified, where the new plan for saving biodiversity was meant to be put on the table. That all had to be cancelled by COVID, but it's happening this year, towards the end of this year. And so a lot of really important international agreements and commitments will be made later in this year. It helps tremendously to have the United States in the team rather than outside the team throwing stones at it. So let's be clear, the issues in the United States actually reside largely in the Senate rather than necessarily the presidency. And we don't know yet what the control of the Senate will be. And that preceded Donald Trump. The United States was not an enthusiastic signatory of the various agreements even before Trump, largely because they were held back by the Senate. But in fairness, if you look across the whole United States, there's a lot of action taking place at city level, at state level, with corporations, etc. So it's not that they're, as a country, not assisting with the climate struggle. It's just that the top leadership for the last 4 years, has been, rubbishing it. And so with that going away, that will help a lot internationally. Because if you look at a country like South Africa, why should we take a whole lot of efforts which will, put people out of work, raise the price of electricity or whatever, if the biggest emitter in the world says, nah, we're not going to do anything. So it's really helpful to have positive messaging coming out of the United States. And I actually am more confident that we will see some improved international efforts on this, during this year. I know that's a low bar, but it's better than nothing.
Absolutely, and you deal with what you're given, don't you? Thanks very much for your time and for weighing in on this important issue, the connections between climate change, environmental considerations, and COVID-19. Professor Bob Scholes is a climatologist and acting director at the Global Change Institute at Wits University. I appreciate your time indeed.